Okay, everybody, so welcome. This is our first video lecture, and this is the Beatles, the early history, and here we go. So a few things that before we get started in this course, I do want to remind everybody that condensing the history of an entire band that existed for 20 years, and more so because their music has a lasting legacy into today's world of music and pop culture, it is nearly impossible to do so. So please understand that we probably will not cover every single album, every single major release and LP. I will do my best to center on some of the more important pieces and facts in their life. But I want you as a student to also bring up some areas that you think are missing and, fill in those lacunae that pop up from time to time. So the other thing that I like to bring up in this course is that we tend to base the Beatles' knowledge and history on hearsay. A lot of the stories that have been told are unverified. A lot of them are anecdotes. A lot of them are just normal, let me tell you a story because my friend told me this and here's what I know. Because people are still alive that knew them, and the band members, two of the band members are still currently living. So it can make it a little difficult to discern fact from fiction. So I will do my best to include sources for you and all references that are pertinent to any of the lectures. And yes, the rest, there is some common knowledge. There's common knowledge that I possess. And please understand that I was not alive in the era. So I want to make sure that anybody who was alive in the era has a voice, and those of you who know stories and want to share out your own experiences are welcome to do so. The next thing is that throughout their multiple interviews that come out in the post-Beatles eras, we will see that there are shifting stories. So one of the things that I like to remind you all in this class is that it might have been that, let's say, Ringo might have said something in 1964, but later renege on that come to, 2019. Or that the way that a name was formed or a song was formed, there might be a new interview that popped up 30 years later surrounding that same issue. So just be aware that people's memories change, and that even the people in the band have had different interpretations of their own histories since the inception of the band. So just, be aware of, this is part of the issue when we do historiography, right? Is how we are seeing through a different lens and through space and time. This isn't stagnant music, and neither are the reception histories. So the next thing, none of these members had formal training. George Harrison did have some guitar lessons, but I just want you to know that this is not, the stuff of, a musician who's been training since they were 6 years old. There's none of that here. As we'll get into, a lot of the band members, all of the band members came from a working class background. Having music lessons is expensive, and having instruments is expensive. So I do want to speak to you in a minute about some of their first instruments, but just know that none of them were formally trained. They were learning chords as teenagers on guitars and basses and mandolin at one point. So again, put the band into the era and space in which they lived, because the way that we are experiencing the Beatles now is much different from the way that the music affected people when it came out in the early 60s. And the receptions and the reactions to said music will be different from how we're going to react now. So again, I want you to always put the band into the era and space from which they originated. Also, please help yourself in this class too. Besides the content that I will deliver, there are multiple bibliographies, biographies, books, anthologies, series, you name it. All sorts of documentaries that are dedicated to this band. And I want you to make sure you use your resources for this class. We have a fabulous library. There are some paper book, print books, yay, and internet resources through our library. So please go use that. Use the databases. And finally, use your own voice, right? If you have any, opinions, this is part of the course, right? I do want to remind you too that as we progress in this course, and a lot of you have studied different types of music, jazz musicians, and maybe some more of the classical styles and things for music appreciation. This is a different genre, right? This is clearly rock and pop. And again, I want you to question people's reactions to the Beatles, and I'm going to start you out with something that was sort of, I would say on a negative note, was Quincy Jones. When he reported to the New Yorker in 2018, he stated that the Beatles were kind of lousy musicians, and he stated he wasn't very impressed. And, Quincy, given, if you know his history and everything, I mean, he can play, we know this, and he's produced and talented and all of that. I just don't want to take away from the fact that, yes, the Beatles were not, this isn't going to be, you're not getting Sonny Rollins. You're not getting somebody with this, somebody who can improvise endlessly, and go into all of these difficult chords. You're not getting that. What you are getting with the Beatles is songwriting. You're getting chemistry. You're getting humor on and off stage. You're getting this very playful interaction with the audience. And in my opinion, a very deep meaning in lyrical content that is a different style of presenting music, right? So again, I think that was his, Quincy's, reaction there, was that he was saying maybe they're not the best musicians, right? So I don't, you'll hear musicians critiquing each other all the time, and I don't want to censor that in this course at all. But yes, were there guitarists that are better than John Lennon? Sure. Are there drummers better than Ringo? Sure. They exist. But I want you to question, why is it the Beatles as musicians have this lasting legacy over the other people that I might have mentioned right now? Okay, so let's go into this. I want to situate you in Liverpool, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of blocking the edge of it, but you can see there, Liverpool is sort of up north, right, into the west in the UK, and you can see here, just please remember, Liverpool is not London. This was not the thriving cosmopolitan city, and not to be mean to any of the Liverpudlians that may be listening, but this was clearly too, when they're coming up in the post-war era, these are working class families. Remember that this was a port city, right? This is an industrial city. This isn't let's go to the opera and let's go to these, let's go have tea at these tea houses. Like, no, there's none of that happening. This is truly, like, the city was dilapidated even in the 50s when the Beatles were coming up. There were still remnants of bomb craters. There was rusting out in the buildings. People were still on rations for simple, like, butter, milk, and coal. So this is how the four of them are growing up. And they developed these really close-knit communities, right? Maybe I know the word enclave can be kind of sketch in some situations, but if you will, right, permit me. And these young kids are coming up together, and what do they do, in school, right? Outside of school, let's form a band, let's hang out. And please know that, again, a lot of the early influences of the Beatles are going to be American rock music, our American ballads, a lot of the things from the standards, the songbook, and then also another genre called skiffle was really popular, and that was a lot of found objects coming together to create instruments. So I'll explain that a little bit in the next slide. Just before I go on, let's have a straightforward slide so you can all see here. I do want to point out to you that all of them are born during the war. And I think it's really important that we just place the dates on a timeline for ourselves to understand how far removed they are from the war, to what's happening in 1950, to how old they are by the time we get to 1964. Just place it in perspective, right? And again, just all entirely self-taught. And then I do want to mention Brian Epstein there is their early manager. He was a record store owner in Liverpool. And remember that the Beatles they did not have a manager for a very long time. So I'm just going to get into the basic origins, and some of you have heard these tropes before. So if you do not need this information, fast forward. It is okay with me. Feel free to rewind at any point. But so the origins of the band date back to 57, and in some case 56, because John Lennon is in high school and he forms a band. So just remember that it's John's band first. And you can see I've listed some of the original members there. And later what happens is Paul McCartney joins in 1957, and they meet up at a church function, of all things, at the parish. And the rest is history, right? I do want to add a small note right there. I added in Stu Sutcliffe because he was the bass player first before Paul. And you're going to hear some of these other Beatles that are going to come and go. But Stu was in the Beatles first originally, and then later he gets replaced. So we'll get into it much later. The other thing I wanted to add there is I kind of added in the wrong place, but the skiffle band, just so that you know, a lot of what John's first band, the materials that they were playing, a lot of it was skiffle, a lot of it was banjo styles. And again, don't forget that the banjo was a very popular instrument for young kids coming up in the 30s, 40s, 50s in the UK. And if you really want to delve back to any of your music appreciation courses, the banjo can be traced back to the minstrelsy tours whenever those were coming through the UK in the late 1870s, 1880s. So it's kind of the same thing that happened in the US post-emancipation. That banjo, for some reason, it really stuck. And so I know that, let's see, Ringo's mom had bought him a banjo, John Lennon had a banjo, but they chose guitar ultimately. Well, he did. So just as a note, and yeah, but check out Lonnie Donegan. He has a really killer version of, well, there's a fun version of, I think, Rock Island Line, and there's another one called Does Your Chewing Gum Lose Its Flavor? And a really good version of the Battle of New Orleans, in my opinion. So check those out if you can, so you can get an idea of what their influences are. In addition to that, do not forget that in the times that they're coming up, right, I want you to go back and look to what's happening in 57 and 58 on the UK and the US pop charts. You know, yes, it's the time of the tail end of Dean Martin and this sort of thing, but you're starting, you know, you're getting Chuck Berry and you're getting Little Richard. You know, I'm trying to think, the Everly Brothers, the Righteous Brothers. You're getting all of these, the girl groups, right? So there's a lot of influences that are bouncing back and forth, right? And I just want you to know that one thing I've always admired about the Beatles is that they've always stated, you know, been very forthcoming. Here's our influences. Here is who we listened to. Here's who we covered, right? And you think about some of their earliest songs, they're covering Smokey Robinson and the Isley Brothers. So there's no mincing, you know, their first, you know, loves of music, I can suppose to say, were absolutely American soul and R&B. Also, okay, the Quarrymen, because they went to Quarry Bank High School. In 1958, George Harrison joins up, and please note that they are going to be 3 guitarists with a rotating drummer, and George was not particularly favored by John because he was only 14 at the time. So imagine being 17, getting ready to turn 18, and here you are with this freshman that you're going to bring into your band. So there were some questions there, but George was an excellent guitarist, and according to John in his anthology interview, sorry, not the Paul in the anthology interview, he knew more chords, quote unquote. So please know that the way that the Beatles learned is they would learn a new chord, and then they would write a song around that chord in the early days. So it was really cool to see that kind of a process. I'd like to adapt that myself. So we have a couple of different names that they go through. So the Quarrymen are one of them. You can see here I listed the Silver Beatles, and they became the Beatles again. Then Johnny and the Moondogs. You'll see that a lot of the stories range. Again, here we go with the anecdotes. Some people say it was Beatles because the word beat is in there or has a beat to it. Then the other trope is that it's an homage to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So they call themselves the Beatles, and supposedly Stu Sutcliffe came up with that one. But then according to Harrison, he got it from a Marlon Brando film where this guy named Johnny was in a gang. So he started Johnny and the Moondogs. So I leave you to interpret how they got the name on your own. I'm certainly not the Beatles aficionado by any means. I'm just kind of sharing out some information. But again, just note that I put in there too, Pete Best is there for 2 years. they needed somebody to join them on the tour when they go to Hamburg. And so Pete Best is recruited for that. And then shortly after, again, you can see this in the interviews, they say that Pete wasn't either showing up for rehearsals or the chemistry was off. And so he was asked to leave, and then Ringo Starr replaces him. And just so that you know, Ringo in 1962 was the best drummer in Liverpool. So they weren't just searching for a friend anymore or somebody local. They wanted the best, and they got Ringo. So it's just a nice, solid history for you. Please add anything else in you want to. You can always ask me questions about any of this. The other thing I want to share out too is to please remind everybody what's happening in the United States at this time. And I do this because right around, remember that at the tail end of 63, we are going to get in the United States, we're just going to start to get some of the singles released right after Christmas. And then beginning in February, the Beatles are full out Beatlemania. They're on Ed Sullivan, right? So just take a look here for yourself and kind of see the, I don't know how to say this, but this is just the truth. It's just, these are assassinations. These are very sad experiences that the nation was going through. A lot of racial segregation issues happening here. Also, there's developments here for civil rights. And this is particular to the United States, right? So I just put some things here just to give you an idea. Every single month in 1963, there's a major civil rights leader either being killed or brought to the attention by the media. Also, I put there on October 1st, there's the President's Committee for the Status of Women. That was presented to Kennedy. And then Kennedy's assassinated on November 22nd of that year. Sam Cooke, a month later, releases this song, A Change Is Gonna Come, right? So, and then just a few days later, we get I Want to Hold Your Hand. So some of the materials that I've read will argue that these events that cause, and you have to remember, these events that you're seeing here, Medgar Evers and all of this, even Malcolm X, everything that happened in this year, Americans were not used to seeing people dead on television every day like this, right? They're not used to seeing or hearing, you know, and it's in their face, it's on TV. Remember, now we have phones and we have media and tablets and Instagram, and we're seeing this all the time at our choosing, right? At that time, you had to physically go and, you know, watch TV with your friends, with your family, at a store, in a window, right? And you had to forcibly go to see these things. So now that this media is put in people's faces, I just want you to think how much more real it became for the people living in that time. And I don't want to take away from anybody's experience if you were alive at that time, but I'm just trying to offer a comparison between the way we receive media today and the way it was received when our president was shot in 1963. So please just consider that. And then we get to the beginning of 1964, and we'll go into that. I skipped around. Oops. Here we go. Sorry. Here we go. So Ed Sullivan's show, what happens is that there are multiple appearances. The manager, Brian Epstein, meets with Ed Sullivan, and they decide, okay, I'm going to do some recruiting, and they hire them for 3 weekends in a row, right? So the 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd of February are their big appearance. So I don't want you to think that the day the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. They were on Ed Sullivan a bunch of times that year. And then also they come back in 1965. And of course, after 66, they stop. They're like, I'm done touring. But in these particular initial episodes, you know, the 16th was, you know, She Loves You. I saw her standing there, From Me to You. I Want to Hold Your Hand. The 23rd, my birthday, Twist and Shout, Please Please Me, and again, I Want to Hold Your Hand. So you can see the popular songs at the time and what people wanted, and it's just very telling of this. There was this needed healing that needed to be happening in the nation. So here's the actual tour dates that were set. It was August 19th to September 20th of 1964. And for those of you who are my audio files and instrument files, if that's a word, I have listed all of the specific instruments that each Beatle used on the tour. And so you can go and look up all the Rickenbackers and the Gibsons and that really cool violin looking thing that Paul used to play, the Hofner bass. But yes, so go ahead and you can consider these for yourself. These are not going to be on a quiz, but they're pretty cool. So take a screenshot if you need to. And then let's look at the dates and let's look at where they toured. And I'm blocking a few things, so I'll explain to you what they are. But I just want to point out that they open up the first U.S. tour at the Cow Palace right here in the Bay Area. And it's not technically San Francisco, it's Daly City. And just take a look at some of the places they played. Some of these, yeah, I mean, the Hollywood Bowl is a huge deal, right? But then they played some fairs. Right? And you're thinking, wait, what? A state fair? Wait, does that even, how does that work? It's the Beatles. But remember, these are the early days and people are still, getting acquainted. And especially if you lived in sort of, think about if you're in a major city, right? Like Chicago, like New York, you would have had more access to albums, records. But for people who were living in the center of the U.S. and maybe didn't have access, right, this was their opportunity to go, yeah, let's go to Atlantic City. Let's take the drive to Milwaukee. Let's take, so just think about how different cities and different people reacted. One of the things I did want to point out too is the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville. I think you can see it right here. That was September 11th, 1964. Huge attendance there, 32,000. And this was an important date in their history because they refused to play for a segregated audience. And after that date, they made sure that they put into their contract that all concerts would be, integrated, if that's, so that there was no separation of people based on color or creed. And that is very telling, of course, just again in 1964, but it's a huge civil rights movement and a huge act in itself for a band, to use their platform. So I just want you to know that that was in their contract, even for years after, okay? Also, take a look at, let's go to the next slide. I have some of the later dates. And by the way, the ones that I'm hiding, Chicago, September 64, and Detroit, September 64. So just know that. And then the others here, Cleveland, New Orleans, they played City Park Stadium. Some of these don't exist anymore. The one in Detroit is no longer, for example. And they finish out at the Paramount Theater in New York, right, which is, again, the small one. So we have, look at the attendance, right, for a small theater versus these huge stadiums that they were playing. But that's the first tour. All right. Excuse me. Now, I am going to talk to you about Beatlemania. And I want you to think about what were some of the... Sorry about that. Somebody came to my door that I was not expecting. So, I do want to just speak to you briefly about Beatlemania. And please know that when this phenomenon happened, some people will say it's the first time this happened in history and there was such a frenzy and everything. I just don't want us to forget that it's not necessarily the first time. Please know that, even as early as the 40s when the big bands were touring, this happened with Frank Sinatra and Tommy Dorsey, right? There's famous stories about how a lot of what they would call the Bobby Soxers were getting so excited and frenzied and screaming and passing out and all of this. But it is the time, again, this has to do with media. It's the first time that it was in our faces that we saw, on NBC, right? Or Walter Cronkite or whoever is telling us, by the way, look at these crazy youths who are passing out and screaming. And so part of this, and again, there's many sociological studies that have been done on this, Beatlemania in particular, where it's just a mass crowd of people getting so excited to witness a very important spectacle. For them, it could be music, it could be art, depending on what it is, right? But the idea is when you have the mass of the people getting so excited that it creates the frenzy, right? Which leads to what they called hysteria at the time, right? But this is people, young people passing out. And this did affect men and women. Don't think that this was just on the media. They portray a lot of the women, but there are instances of young boys as well. Because it was that, think about the target music industry is 12 to about 16, right? Think to this day, people look this up. So it starts as early as 12, and you know, if you have these little 45 records, think about the fact that it was easy to just have them, bring them to your friend's house, play them. So they were familiar with the songs. They have the magazines because they see pictures of them. Now they're watching them on Ed Sullivan. So these were accessible things. And we're going to get into some of the class issues too, because remember, you had to be able to afford an album, which was $4 or $5 at the time. Or I'm sorry, $4 or $5 for the tickets, right? You had to at least pay 40, 50 cents for these 45 records. I mean, things were not cheap, just like today. So let's just take a look, and hopefully this works for you.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you tomorrow. My loving to you. I pretend that
And some of the sound but this is Pan Am when they returned to the UK, and you can see deplaning, right? And it's just constantly screaming. So I'm going to turn this down. It's just constantly screaming that's been in the media at the time, and it shows everybody yelling so much. Please note too that a lot, just the Beatles in general, they had a really difficult time hearing themselves on those early PA systems, because when they were singing on stage, especially in the early tour dates, they didn't get the best stages, right? Not until a little bit later. So their PA systems couldn't keep up with the sheer amount of noise that's coming at them, and they couldn't hear themselves from their own amps. So just note that sometimes if you ever hear early the loops that are played, sometimes you'll see on YouTube, there's what do you call a sound producer who's decided to separate the different tracks, and you'll hear that they sound terrible because they're completely out of tune because they can't hear each other. So, all right, so I hope this helped you.